Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining today's Variable O&M Cost Review training. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the chat panel located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you have a question throughout the conference, please feel free to direct it to everyone via the chat drop-down menu. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. All audio lines will be muted until the designated Q&A portions of the call, and we will provide you with instructions on how to ask a question at that time. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. With that, I'll turn it over to Radha Madrigal. Radha, please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Radha Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I am joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during Q&A or to provide clarity when needed as we discuss this topic. We'll do a quick roll call of folks that are on the line. And so I think we'll just go in alphabetical order here. David, if you wouldn't mind saying hello. You can take yourself off of mute.
All right. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hi. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is David Luke. I am the project manager for this project.
Thanks, David. And then Jenny?
My name is Jenny Araj, and I am with the market analysis team.
And Katie?
Hi, this is Katie Wickler with the market analysis team.
And Kevin?
Hey, it's Kevin Head, also market analysis team.
And Rodney, who will be helping me with the Q&A, if you can say hello as well.
Good morning, Roddy Jackson, Senior Client Trainer, supporting with Radha today.
And then finally, Trang. And you might be double muted, possibly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So this is Trang Vo from the Program Management Office.
Wonderful. All right, thanks, everyone. So that's who we have gathered here to chat with you today. We're here to talk about the changes being implemented as part of the Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review Initiative. As Adam indicated, in an effort to increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted on the California ISO website so that you can review it in the future. And for those of you who are not able to join today's call, that should be posted in about 3 business days, so look for that early next week. The slide presentation has been posted to kaiso.com, and you can find it in a number of different places. You can find it on the release planning page under the independent 2021 releases. You can find it in the Learning Center under new modules. And if you're looking at the stakeholder initiative page for Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review, you'll find that presentation there as well. A couple of housekeeping items. As Adam indicated, all of the lines have been muted to minimize background noise. We're going to be taking verbal questions or written questions throughout the presentation. You can raise your hand to ask a verbal question or write your questions there in the chat pod. And again, raising your hand using the WebEx interactivity tools or pressing #2 on your telephone keypad will get you into that verbal question queue. First, just a high level of the objectives for this particular initiative. This initiative updates the default values for variable operations and maintenance adders that are used in the calculation of default energy bids and also commitment costs. Variable O&M costs can be reflected in startup and minimum load costs and/or default energy bids, replacing the current cost framework of the major maintenance adders and the variable O&M adders. This initiative also adds explicit principles to the tariff for categorizing operations and maintenance costs to better differentiate between the fixed costs and the variable costs. I've structured this training into 3 basic sections. First, we're going to go over a high-level review of what the changes are, and then we will talk specifically about the application-specific changes, and at the end, we have a discussion about the changes being made to the actual calculations. We'll be using a number of acronyms throughout the presentation, and you can see a list of those here. If you're following along with the presentation that's posted on kaisa.com, you can also refer back to this page if you wanted to refresh your memory on what those stand for. So first, we'll dive into the variable O&M cost review and give you a high level of the initiative. From a timing perspective, there was the tariff amendment filed with FERC in March of this year, and the approval for that amendment obtained in May. There is not a specific market simulation for this effort, as there are no code changes for market participants to test and preview. With that said, there are some new fields being added to master file and bid validation rules being updated in Cyber. I will cover those items a bit later when we talk about the application-specific details. In anticipation of the new default O&M adder values, we are encouraging scheduling coordinator to consider whether they would like to negotiate adders under the updated cost framework that we've introduced in this initiative. We've already received a number of applications to negotiate costs, and in a little bit, I'll review the process for how to submit an application if you have not done so yet. The tariff amendment that establishes these new default adder values and the new cost categorization principles will become effective on January 1st, 2022. So at a high level, let's go over the changes that will be implemented. First of all, just for some background, this project is changing the structure of how the O&M costs are accounted for in the ISO markets to ensure that market participants' bids reflect these costs more accurately. We have adopted a new framework for O&M cost recovery based on new O&M adders for startup, minimum load, and for energy costs. These new adders will replace the existing adders for major maintenance expenses and for variable O&M costs. Any existing negotiated variable O&M adders or major maintenance adders that were existing as of January 1st, 2022 will be legacied in under the new cost framework. This slide here contains a visual of the O&M cost framework that is made up of proxy costs, the variable O&M adders, and the cost components. The term variable O&M adder refers to any or all of three separate adders that we'll be discussing throughout this presentation: the variable energy O&M adder, the variable minimum load O&M adder, and the variable startup O&M adder. Each of those three adders is included in a generating resources proxy costs, and these adders represent the ISO's estimate of the variable costs of generating resources. And then proxy costs are also used in either the bid caps for minimum load costs and startup costs, or the default energy bids for local market power mitigation. A little bit of a discussion about choosing between either the default values or the negotiated values. First of all, for the default values, market participants can use these default VO&M adders based on resource technology type if they don't want to pursue that negotiated option. The default option is sufficient for many market participants and requires no action. The ISO assigns those values based on the resource's master file data. And here we're seeing that most resources won't need to necessarily take an action here because either the default values are sufficient for their purposes or they've already negotiated a major maintenance adder that they will continue to use. But these negotiated values that we are, or this negotiated option for those values can be negotiated by submitting an application to do so. That negotiated option requires more effort from the market participant, but it also can help them more accurately reflect the O&M costs in their proxy costs. So that's the difference between the default and the negotiated values. And we'll be discussing now the cost categorization principles. They fall into two buckets. The first category is variable operations. Now, these variable operations costs are the costs of consumables and other costs that vary directly with electrical production of a resource, like your startup and shutdown, your run hours, or your electricity output. The variable operation costs exclude maintenance costs, auxiliary power costs, the greenhouse gas allowance prices, the fuel costs, GMC, opportunity costs, and other excluded costs. So that's the variable operations category. And then we have the variable maintenance category. And these costs are associated with the repair, the overhaul, the replacement, or inspection of a resource that meets the following conditions. So the costs must vary with the electrical production of the resource. The costs should reflect future maintenance costs that are expected to be incurred within the service life of a major component of the plant or equipment, and they should be consistent with good utility practice. They should not affect a substantial betterment of a resource, and if the item is a replacement, it cannot be a replacement of an existing major component of the plant or equipment. So that is a high-level breakdown of what the categorizations fall into. We have provided and posted written guidance on how you would submit an application to negotiate those costs. That has been posted to the release planning page in the form of an updated attachment L. That attachment goes to the BPM for market instruments. The updated cost framework, those cost categorization principles, and also the new default values have been posted and provided in that updated attachment L. It also discusses the treatment of currently negotiated variable O&M maintenance adders and major maintenance adders under the updated cost framework. I did want to make a note about the attachment L. It represents a draft BPM that was provided to assist with this negotiation process. We will also be making other edits to the BPM for market instruments, to the BPM for generator management, and also to the configuration guide for charge code 7020, which refers to the daily RMR capacity payment. I'll mention that again when we talk about calculations. A note here about the updated business practice manuals is that the team is targeting by the end of this month to have all of those PRRs submitted. Speaking about submitting applications for negotiated variable O&M adders, the way or the process for doing so is to submit an application via a city ticket using case record type negotiated rate application and application type MMA. You should also add text inside of that city ticket that says new O&M framework and use the new template that's available. So there is a template that we have a link to here and also in the resource section of the material that discusses this new template. Oops, didn't mean to go up, meant to go down. Also wanted to mention that we ask that you review both the detailed guidance in the updated attachment L and complete that template before submitting the city ticket. If you have any questions at all throughout this entire process regarding the variable O&M initiative, you can submit those via a city inquiry ticket with a request that the ticket be routed to the market analysis team. Members of that market analysis team are those majority of the folks who are participating on today's call and will be around for questions and answers. So before we dive into application-specific changes, I wanted to check in to see if anybody had any questions just at a high level on what we've discussed so far. So Adam, if you could give instructions about making yourself known for a verbal question.
No problem. So ladies and gentlemen, if you have your chat panel open and you look to sort of the top right of that window, there should be a raise hand icon. If you press that, it'll place you into the verbal question queue, and we can get you unmuted to ask your question. All right, and I do see we have someone in the queue already. Kathleen, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have a question about the submitting of the ticket and the guidance, the attachment L, I believe. So what I'm confused about, and I was wondering if you could share any clarity on it, is that for the overlap of ESDR 4's implementation with this implementation, we are needing to go through and submit these requests for a new O&M framework to support the ESDR 4 functionality. And so we need to get that started kind of like now rather than waiting for this deadline. I saw that you said that the comments about the treating existing ones as legacies, but is there an expectation that we start following the process that you just described with a specific template and that attachment, even for what we're doing this current fall? Can you just talk a little bit to that?
Yeah. Hey, Kathleen, this is Kevin Head. Thanks for the question. So the storage DEB has a variable storage operations cost. That is, we kind of have our own separate track for that, and that's not included in this variable operations and maintenance cost process. They're two kind of separate tracks. They speak to similar underlying costs, but the VOM value, say for a storage resource, will be negotiated separately than the kind of registration process that we've implemented for the variable storage operations cost. And there should have been an outreach on how to register the variable storage operations cost separately. So that has its own thing. You have to put a particular title in the city ticket. So we consider those separately. They're not used in the same calculations. Does that help?
That does help. And just as a tiny bit of feedback, so we did attend the training. So if that was the outreach that you're referring to, it said to submit a city ticket. It didn't provide any additional details. And I know that we haven't received any other specific instructions. So if you have an expectation that something else was sent, I just wanted to flag for you that as of right now, the only instruction is just to submit the city ticket.
Okay. Yeah, sure. We can, we have an email drafted so we can make sure that's sent over to the folks at Vistra. So.
Yeah, that sounds great. That's helpful for that. Looking forward for like new resources that we're looking to set this up for that come commercial after this is updated. Are you saying that that process will always kind of stay as a separate process, and that what we kind of learn through this initial run, we can think of that as going forward business as well? Or once this gets implemented, for our future resources, should we be looking towards this new attachment L and kind of expect changes?
They'll remain to be separate processes.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
All right, and we do not have any additional questions in the queue at this time. Oh, and I do see one more question. Jeff, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Jeff. The question is regarding you said submit the application for the negotiate rate application, and also you talk about for the application type of the MLA, the major maintenance cost. And based on my understanding, that the major maintenance cost, the adder, this would be gone, right?
yeah, if I understand the question correctly, you're just checking to make sure that the major maintenance adder will no longer exist and that it's replaced with the variable operations and maintenance cost adder.
So we negotiated the cost adder is focused on variable operation and the variable maintenance cost adder, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and as Rada was saying, if you have a negotiated major maintenance adder or a negotiated, what we currently call the VOM adder, those will be legacied in under this new policy. So in some respects, it's a new thing, but in some respects, it's just a change in terminology.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
All right, and we do not have any additional questions in the queue at this time.
Great, thanks, Adam. I'll go ahead and continue. So now we're going to dive into the application-specific details. We're going to talk about first the master file changes and then the cyber validation rule changes. At a high level, the changes that are happening to master file, we will have those default variable energy, the minimum load, and the startup O&M adders stored in master file on a resource and MSG configuration specific level. So that would be variable minimum load O&M adder, the variable startup O&M adder, and then the variable energy O&M adder, which today is a field that exists on a resource level, but is something new being added to the MSG configuration level. We're also adding in a new flag at the resource level to identify whether the values that are listed are going to be the default values or negotiated values, and that field is the minimum load and startup O&M adder indicator. And there's also, as Kevin indicated a moment ago, some of this is a new framework and some of it is just making some adjustments. So we are making some field name changes. The variable energy O&M adder field is replacing the operating maintenance cost field. And then we have the variable energy O&M adder type, which replaces the existing operating maintenance adder type. And I've got a screenshot of both the resource tab and then coming up in a moment, the MSG configuration tab, so we can kind of visually see what we're talking about. On the left-hand side of this image, there's two columns there that were previously named other things, and those names are changing, and that's the energy O&M adder and the energy O&M adder type, those fields. Those are the new names, and then we're adding those three new fields for the minimum load O&M adder, the startup, and then the indicator as to whether those values are going to be default or negotiated. You can see a note about that particular field at the bottom of this slide here. So that flag is used to identify whether the variable min load and startup costs and maintenance adders are either default or negotiated values. There is some differentiation in the way those values are, or differentiation in the unit of measurement of those values based on whether they are negotiated or default. For the minimum load O&M adder, that is the variable minimum load O&M costs that are incurred in terms of hours of operation. For resources that have a negotiated variable minimum load O&M adder, you will see that value displayed in that field. And based on whether it's negotiated or default will determine the unit of measurement. So if it is a negotiated rate, the units are in dollars per run hour. If it is a default rate, then those units are in dollars per run hour per megawatt of your resources Pmax. The startup O&M adder is for the variable startup O&M costs incurred in terms of starts. If you have a negotiated variable for that resource, then you will see the value displayed in that field. And again, the unit of measurement differs based on whether you're using a negotiated or a default value. If it is a negotiated value, you'll see the units in dollars per start. And if it is a default value, the units are going to be in dollars per start per megawatt of that resource's Pmax. And then on the MSG configuration tab, the energy O&M adder field is variable energy O&M costs incurred in terms of megawatt hours. For resources that have a negotiated variable energy O&M adder, you'll see the value displayed in that field. And I've highlighted in the screenshot there these new fields that are going to be on the MSG configuration tab. Again, with the minimum load and the startup adders, the same concept applies. The minimum load values are incurred in terms of hours of operation. If the value is a negotiated one, you will see the value in that field. And if it's negotiated, the units are in dollars per run hour. If it's a default, the units will be in dollars per run hour per megawatt of that resource's Pmax. And similarly with the startup costs, those are costs incurred in terms of starts. You'll see the negotiated value listed if you have a negotiated value. And again, those will be dollars per start if negotiated, or if it's the default values being used, it'll be dollars per start per megawatt of Pmax. Another thing to point out with regard to master file changes, we have under generation technology type, the existing CT tech type of GTUR, or gas turbine, will be used to indicate the aeroderivative CTs, and a new type, FTUR, or frame turbine, will be added to capture the default values for the frame CTs. A point here is in about the mid-May timeframe, May 18th, I believe it was, there was some outreach done to scheduling coordinators with the GTUR, with the gas turbine resources, to clarify or to confirm our interpretation of that resource, and to have you validate that information. So if you did receive that research, or did receive that outreach, please respond to it. And also, if you want to validate this for your particular resource, or check that your resource, what it was set up as, you can open a city ticket and ask that it be routed to, again, the market analysis team to validate and make sure that we have interpreted that generator correctly and appropriately identified them in either the existing or the new Gen Tech category. Before we go to cyber, let's take a pause here to see if folks have questions about master file changes before we talk about the cyber changes. So Adam, if we can check if there's any verbal questions.
No problem. Once again, just use the raise hand icon located to the top right of the chat panel. All right, and I do see we have a question in the queue. Christine, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead. And Christine, just a reminder to take your personal device off mute.
Hi, I apologize. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. This is Christy with Salt River Project. I had a question on the last couple of slides. The first one is related to the change in the gas turbine, so the GTUR versus the FTUR. Which team did you recommend reaching out to clear that definition up?
That would be the market analysis team, by submitting a city inquiry ticket with your question, and then having that, yes, routed to market analysis.
And when would you recommend adopting that change, or when is the timeline for that change becoming active in the master file? Would that be the January 1st?
Kevin, can you give me some clarity on that particular item?
So I am not sure about when it can possibly be put in, where it depends on how we decide to deploy the code. So it's possible that some of these changes will be kind of deployed but kind of inactive until January 1st. Our plan with this, though, the distinction between FTUR and GTUR, is to do an outreach to everybody who has this distinction that needs to be made, and then just do one master file update, because we're going to be updating not only like this distinction but also the default values. So we were going to do one kind of bulk upload, changing these based on the feedback we've heard from market participants. And we also did some of the split between FTUR and GTUR based on information that we had from past negotiations of MMAs. So, yeah. Is that helpful, Christine?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we can keep the current defaults as is until, we have everything set up with the new negotiated defaults, if we're doing that, or the, negotiated rates versus the default. So as long as, I guess, those are, that we're not doing that before the 1st of January, or at least before we have a chance to finish all the negotiations.
Yeah, so the new defaults will not go into effect until January 1st.
Okay.
And that's the expected date based on the current project plan. The old defaults, they'll, the current defaults, but the ones that will be old defaults, will switch they'll turn into pumpkins at midnight, and the new defaults will go into effect. If there's negotiations ongoing, the same rule applies. We've tried to get folks to negotiate on the earlier side, and we still have 2.5 months to complete those negotiations, but we kind of have that cutoff date of January 1st for any existing default values.
Okay, great. So it sounds like the FTUR would just use the current default that's the same as the GTUR until then?
Yeah, I think the current default for this GTUR plus gas combination is like $2.80. But don't quote me on that. And then it will be, any turbine that is characterized under GTUR will begin using the aeroderivative default, and any that we've identified as FTUR will start using the frame turbine default on January 1st, except if there's already a negotiated value.
Thank you. My second question is related to the prior slide. So the defaults, are these in terms of per megawatt of Pmax of that particular configuration, if it's at the configuration level?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had. Thank you very much.
All right, and we do not have any additional questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Before I move on to the cyber, I know I just hit the scroll bar here and moved through a couple of slides. Do we have any questions in the chat before we get to the next section.
Yes, Rada, we do have a question in the chat from David Redding. It's, does the current version of the GRDT file, version 15, incorporate all the changes being made by KaiCell?
So the changes were actually made to version 16 of the GRDT, and you can see a draft of that on the release planning page. So no, these changes haven't been incorporated into the current version. There is an updated draft version of this GRDT on the release planning page. I think I also have a link to that at the end of this presentation, but I'm not 100% sure. But you can find that on the release planning page. So thank you, David, for your question. All right, I'm going to move on now to cyber. Just a quick couple updates about cyber. We will be updating the cyber rules to reflect these changes that we're making to the terminology. So we're going to change references to the major maintenance adders to the new terms that will be replacing those, which are the variable startup and minimum load O&M adders. Also in cyber, based on whether you're choosing the default values or the negotiated rate values, cyber is going to use either that resource or configuration specific O&M adder to calculate the proxy minimum load costs and startup costs, including the reasonableness threshold. If the resource has elected the default option, cyber will do an automatic calculation. And I won't read the calculation, the mathematical calculation out there, but you can see that there will be a calculation that takes the min load or the startup O&M adders and multiplies that by the resource's Pmax in order to obtain that specific number. We're going to also be updating the minimum load cost to include the min load and energy O&M adders. And again, based on whether you select default or negotiated in master file, that will be incorporated appropriately. Any questions about the cyber changes before we move on to talking about changes being made to the calculations? Adam, if we could check verbal questions first.
Sure. Rada, I do not think we have any questions in the verbal queue at this time.
All right, and I'm not seeing any in the chat, so we'll move on to the next piece. Here we're going to talk about changes to the calculations. This table here shows you the default variable O&M adder values. These are the values that are changing as part of this initiative. If these values don't work for you, then our recommendation is to pursue the negotiated option using the process that we just discussed previously, where you would fill out the template and then submit that through the city ticket and route that to the market analysis team. So this is a list here of the default values. I'm not going to read them one by one, but you'll have access to this list when you review the presentation at a later date. I did want to go over a couple of examples of the new flags. This table here shows the examples of the two new flags in use, and it's kind of a lot of information on the screen, so you might kind of be wondering, what am I looking at here? I wanted to help you point out what you should take a look at or direct your attention to. We have set up this table with example data for regular resources at the top. In the first 4 rows, you can see that resource A through resource B would be for regular resources, and multi-stage generator resource configurations are shown in the bottom 4 rows. Resource E has 2 configurations, and resource F has 2 configurations. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that the default values are dynamic to the size of the resource and scaled to the Pmax, as compared to the current framework, which is a flat value. For example, if you take a look at resource A, which is using default values, you can see that the startup O&M adder is in dollars per starts per megawatt. Whereas if you take a look at resource D, which has negotiated values, you can see that that startup and O&M adder is in dollars per start. So depending on, and we wanted to make that distinction there, depending on whether it's a default value or a negotiated value, we'll have different numbers in those fields based on the choice of default or negotiated. Another note is that the energy O&M adders can be negotiated separately from the startup and the minimum load adders. You can see that represented in resource B and resource C on this table. So for example, if you take a look at resource B, they're using the default values for the minimum load and startup and a negotiated value for the energy O&M adder, and resource C is an opposite of that. And another point that we wanted to make here, in the past, we could only negotiate the variable O&M adder for an MSG at the resource level, but now with this particular implementation, we can negotiate different values for the different configurations, and you'll see that reflected in the MSG examples. So resource E has different configurations with different values, and resource F has different configurations with different values listed there. So with that, I want to see if we have any questions on the material we've covered so far. I think there was a question in the chat that we may have answered in discussion, but perhaps one that's pending. I think these are coming, I'm not sure if Rodney, you can see these. I think these are coming to me directly.
Yes, I believe they're coming to you directly. I don't see anything in the
Okay, so a question with regard to PMAX. The question was asking, is that the master file PMAX or the OMS potentially adjusted PMAX? Can we provide some clarity on that?
So I think, hey, this is Kevin again. I think the question is if I'm doing some sort of, operations and maintenance on my unit and it's going to increase the PMAX of the resource, and I'm keeping the default value, will the adder value be calculated based on the previous PMAX or the new one? And the answer is it's just dependent on whenever the PMAX is updated in master file. So the trigger for changing what the ultimate adder value will be is based on when the master file change goes into effect. And if that's not the question, feel free to clarify.
Okay, so thanks, Kevin. Emmy, if that answered your question, great. If you want more clarity, if you could provide a little bit more context around it, and we can make sure we get that question answered for you. Adam, I wanted to do a quick check to see if there's any questions, verbal questions.
We do not have any questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay. So moving on through the material, we'll talk about the updated formulas. The primary formulas being modified are for variable cost option, the DEB calculation, and for the proxy cost option, changing formulas to the minimum load bid cap and the startup bid cap. A note here that the changes for the registered cost option are substantially the same as those for the proxy cost option. And given that the registered cost option is much less commonly used than the proxy cost option, the formulas have been excluded from this training for the sake of brevity, but they will be located in the attachment G of the market instruments BPM once that gets updated through the PRR process. At a high level, I just wanted to point out the changes being made. Again, I'm not going to read through each individual element here, but if you take a look at the variable cost default energy bid formula, you'll see that the current DEB has a calculation that includes a VOM adder, and the new calculation will have the energy O&M adder in the place of that element. That's for the variable cost DEB. If we move on to the proxy minimum load cost formula, you can see that the current minimum load cost calculation has both the VOM adder multiplied by PMIN and a major maintenance adder. In the new calculation, instead of the VOM adder, we're going to have the energy O&M adder multiplied by PMIN and the minimum load O&M adder that replaces that major maintenance adder. And then finally, with the proxy startup cost formula, you'll see that the current formula has a major maintenance adder, whereas the new formula for startup cost is going to have that startup O&M adder in its place. And I have just a handful more slides here, and then we'll open it up for questions about these calculations. From a settlements perspective, we are going to be updating one of the configuration guides, and that will be for charge code 7020, which is the daily RMR capacity payment. Essentially, we'll be changing terminology for the maintenance costs that can be included in the calculation of the RMR capacity payments. And now that we've gotten to the end of the calculations section, I wanted to open it up both for questions either on this calculations piece or any final questions that you might have on anything that we've covered today. So Adam, let's check first for verbal questions.
All right, and I do see we have a question in the verbal queue. Deborah, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Deborah Wardy, and I represent SMUD. SMUD has default energy bids for our hydroelectric plants, and these default energy bids would actually be good estimates of our startup costs for the hydro plants. Currently, we use major maintenance adders, and I'm just wondering if that is possible.
Hey, Deborah, this is Kevin. Are you asking whether you can use the DEB value for the startup cost component here in lieu of a major maintenance adder?
Correct.
So how would you convert a DEB, which is in the form of dollar per megawatt hour, to a dollar per start, which is kind of like a different unit?
I mean, basically what I would assume is I would just multiply it by the capacity, and then that would give you a pretty good estimate of the dollar per hour.
I can't answer your question now, but this is the kind of thing that we typically handle in the negotiation process. So I'd recommend, taking a look at the guidance that we have posted, and if you think that it kind of fits this case that you're asking about, submit an application via the process that Roder described. Or if it doesn't seem to fit well into this bucket, you can feel free to submit just a city ticket asking that it be allocated to the market analysis team, and we can take a look at the case individually. But it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I do not think we have any additional questions in the verbal queue at this time.
I do see one from Emmy Stenstead. So Emmy, I think you had the previous question about the PMAX, and I think the question that I had answered was a different one than the one that you were asking. And the question is, given an OMS ambient D rate decreasing the PMAX of the resource, will we recalculate the variable O&M adder based on that D rate? And the answer is no. It's just based on the master file characteristics rather than a changed max due to an outage card that was submitted. Thanks for the question.
All right, thanks, Kevin, for that clarification. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat. Or do we have another hand raised? I do see a question just popped in the verbal queue. Oh, yep, let's go for that.
All righty. Caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. This is Art with the City of Riverside. We negotiated our VOM values. So at the beginning of 2022, are we supposed to upload a new master file, or is the ISO going to take care of that?
Yeah, Kevin again. As you might have guessed, we will take care of that for you. So upon, January 1st, we'll do like a bulk upload of any of the default values that are changing, and as well as any negotiated values that have completed before, maybe a couple days ahead of time of the go live date. So if you've completed the application, then yes, we will update it for you in master file.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and I do not see any additional questions in the verbal queue.
Okay, and I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So let's move on to the closing portion of this. Folks, I mentioned in the beginning, these slides are posted to the Learning Center, to the release planning page, and also to the stakeholder initiative page. I wanted to thank you very much for your participation in today's session. I hope that we were able to provide you with information and answer your questions. A recording of this session will be posted in a couple of days in all of those places as well. I would say early next week, takes about 3 business days. In the meantime, if you have any questions on anything presented here today, you can also email them to customerreadiness@kaiso.com. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for your participation. We hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you again next time. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes your webinar. Thank you for using Event Services, and you may now disconnect.